Religious people. What would you do if alien life was discovered? Story 1, my religious parents would do absolutely nothing. And that's the whole point, okay? So this answer is the most common response on this entire thread, and it's worth sitting with why. Because it cuts against the assumption a lot of secular people carry into this question. The premise of how would religious people cope with alien discovery often assumes some kind of crisis is coming, that confirmed extraterrestrial life would force a theological reckoning, a Galileo moment where belief has to bend or break under new evidence. For a large number of religious people, that crisis simply doesn't exist as a live possibility, because the core theological claim that God created everything that exists was never actually a claim about the specific contents of creation. It was a claim about the relationship between God and existence itself. Whether existence contains one inhabited planet or 10,000 inhabited planets doesn't change the structure of that relationship at all. It just changes the inventory. This is functionally similar to how most people reacted to the discovery that there are billions of galaxies beyond our own, each containing billions of stars. A discovery that, when you actually think about the scale involved, is almost as cosmologically humbling as confirmed alien life would be. And yet it didn't produce religious crisis at any meaningful scale either. The universe got vastly bigger than previously understood, multiple times over, across the history of astronomy, and theological frameworks that were built to accommodate an infinite, omniscient creator simply absorbed each expansion without structural damage. The nothing response isn't apathy or denial. It's the predictable output of a belief system whose foundational claims were never actually contingent on the universe being small, simple, or human exclusive in the first place. The size of the discovery doesn't matter if the belief was never sized to begin with. Story 2, the Vatican's actual stated position, convert any intelligent life we find this, is one of the more genuinely surprising entries on this list. Because it's not speculation about what the Catholic Church might theoretically think. It's reporting an actual, on-record institutional position, even if the framing requires some careful unpacking. The Vatican Observatory is a real, functioning astronomical research institution, staffed by Jesuit priests who are also professional astronomers. And its representatives have spoken publicly and repeatedly about the theological compatibility of extraterrestrial life with Catholic doctrine. Brother Guy Consolmagno, the observatory's director, has stated explicitly in interviews that he would be happy to baptize an alien if it asked, framing this not as imposition, but as an extension of the Church's mission to all rational and souled beings, wherever they might be found. The theological reasoning behind this isn't casual. It draws on a long tradition within Catholic theology concerning the universality of Christ's redemptive act and the Church's evangelical mandate, which has historically been understood as extending to all of humanity without geographic limitation. The logical extension to non-human rational beings is, within that framework, a relatively short step rather than a radical departure. If a being is capable of reason, free will, and relationship with the divine, the same theological categories that apply to humans would plausibly apply to them too. This stance has also evolved alongside actual church history, with first contact scenarios closer to home. The centuries of theological debate over the personhood and souls of indigenous peoples encountered during the age of exploration set precedents, for better and frequently for worse, that the church has had to reckon with. The instinct to convert isn't unprecedented. It's continuous with exactly how the institution has approached every previous encounter with a population it hadn't previously catechized. Story 3, the universe is big enough to display God's infinite glory. A pastor's actual argument this response captures something genuinely elegant about how a meaningful strand of religious thought has reframed cosmic scale from a threat into supporting evidence. And it's worth taking the argument seriously on its own terms, rather than dismissing it as mere rationalization. The argument runs roughly like this. If God is described as infinite, omnipotent, and the creator of all existence, then a universe that is correspondingly vast, hundreds of billions of galaxies, each containing hundreds of billions of stars, with planets likely outnumbering stars, isn't evidence against such a God. It's the kind of universe you'd actually expect such a God to create. A small, simple universe with one planet and one species would arguably be a stranger, less fitting creation for an infinite being to produce than the genuinely staggering scale we've actually observed. This reframing has real theological precedent. Medieval and early modern theologians, confronting the Copernican revolution's demotion of Earth from the literal center of the universe, developed similar lines of reasoning: that humility about humanity's physical centrality doesn't diminish humanity's theological significance, because significance in this framework was never primarily about spatial position to begin with. Thomas Aquinas and subsequent scholastic theologians built frameworks for divine relationship with creation that were explicitly not contingent on geocentrism, which meant they survived geocentrism's collapse without requiring revision. The argument also does useful work addressing the more pointed version of the alien objection. If God cared about us specifically, why make a universe so enormous that we're statistically irrelevant within it? The pastor's framing flips this. The enormity isn't evidence of divine indifference. It's the necessary scale for genuinely displaying infinite glory. Whether or not you find that persuasive, it's a coherent answer to the objection, rather than an evasion of it. Story 4: a Catholic's honest answer, genuine excitement, then just more faith. Comparison. What's refreshing about this particular response is the honesty of the emotional register, genuine excitement, not defensive minimization, paired with a clear sense of exactly where that excitement would lead, rather than vague hand-waving about how nothing would change. The instinct to immediately want to know what alien beings believe, spiritually, is a genuinely interesting one and reflects something real about how religious people who take their own faith's claims seriously tend to engage with other belief systems generally. If you believe your religion describes something true about the nature of reality, the discovery of another set of conscious, presumably reasoning beings, naturally raises the question of whether they've arrived at similar truths through their own path, different truths that complement yours, or something that challenges your framework in ways worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. The phrase "chalk up the discovery of God once again being God" captures a specific psychological pattern that shows up across many of these responses, treating new, even startling, information as confirmatory rather than disruptive. Because the underlying theological framework was built with enough flexibility to absorb genuinely significant updates without requiring foundational revision. This isn't unique to religious thinking. It's how robust theoretical frameworks of any kind, including scientific ones, are generally supposed to function. A good theory should be able to incorporate startling new data without collapsing, and a good theology, by this logic, should function the same way. What's notable across this entire list, and this response exemplifies it cleanly, is how rarely alien life discovered gets treated by actual religious respondents as the existential crisis that popular secular imagination often assumes it would be. The crisis assumption may say more about secular expectations of religious fragility than about how religious frameworks actually function under genuine theological pressure. Story 5: the awkward truth. Religious people are often pro-science and pro-exploration. This response is doing something genuinely useful for the broader conversation by directly challenging an assumption baked into the question itself. The implicit premise that religious belief and enthusiasm for scientific discovery exist in some kind of natural tension, such that finding alien life would force religious people to choose between their faith and their excitement about the discovery. The actual sociological data on this complicates the popular stereotype considerably. Surveys of religious belief and attitudes towards science consistently find that the overwhelming majority of religious people, across most major traditions, hold positive views of scientific research and exploration, and many actively work within scientific fields themselves, including, notably, within space science and astrobiology specifically, the exact fields most directly relevant to an alien life discovery. The Catholic Church alone funds and operates the Vatican Observatory, employing actual working astronomers who are also ordained clergy, which is a fairly direct institutional rebuttal to the idea that the Church views space science with suspicion or threat. The conflict model narrative, the idea that religion and science are fundamentally opposed forces locked in inevitable confrontation, has been challenged extensively by historians of science, who note that the popular narrative draws disproportionately on a small number of dramatic historical flashpoints, while Galileo's trial being the most famous, while overlooking the much larger, much less dramatic history of religious institutions funding, conducting, and celebrating scientific work across centuries, including the foundational contributions of clergy to fields ranging from genetics, Régis Mendel was an Augustinian friar, to cosmology, Georges Lemaitre, the Catholic priest who first proposed what became Big Bang theory. The bearer of bad news framing in this response is genuinely apt. For many people invested in the conflict narrative, the actual relationship between religious belief and enthusiasm for cosmic discovery is less dramatic and less confirmatory of their expectations than the popular story suggests. Story 6, if God can create one world, why not many? The logic that makes aliens unsurprising this response distills the most common theological logic across this entire list into its simplest form. And it's worth examining why this particular line of reasoning has proven so durable across so many different religious traditions, independently arriving at versions of the same conclusion. The argument has a clean internal structure. Belief in a creator God already requires accepting that this God has the capacity and will to bring an entire complex, functioning world into existence from nothing. Once you've accepted that premise, which is, after all, the foundational claim of theistic creation belief generally, the question of whether that same creative capacity was exercised once or many times becomes a question of degree rather than kind. There's no logical step between God created one inhabited world and God created many inhabited worlds that requires a fundamentally different kind of divine action. It's the same action, repeated, or perhaps more accurately, the same single creative act simply producing a larger total result than previously assumed. This reasoning has actual historical pedigree predating modern astronomy by centuries. Nicholas of Cusa, a 15th century Catholic cardinal and philosopher, speculated about the plurality of inhabited worlds and extraterrestrial life as a natural extension of divine infinitude, well before telescopic astronomy gave humanity any observational basis for considering other worlds seriously. This wasn't a fringe position forced upon reluctant theology by later scientific pressure. Strands of speculative theological openness to plural worlds predate the scientific evidence that would eventually make the question concrete and testable, rather than purely abstract. What this response captures elegantly is that, for many religious frameworks, the many worlds question was never actually closed in the way secular assumptions about religious cosmology often imagine. It was simply unaddressed, pending evidence, rather than ruled out. Story 7, why the existence of God and the existence of aliens were never actually in competition. This response, in its directness, identifies something genuinely important about the underlying logical structure of the question that the broader cultural conversation about religion and aliens frequently gets wrong. The existence of extraterrestrial life and the existence of God are not mutually exclusive claims, and they were never structured as competing explanations for the same phenomenon in the way the popular framing sometimes implies. The confusion seems to stem from a kind of categorical error, treating God and aliens as if they're rival explanatory hypotheses for the same set of facts, competing answers to a single question like, why does life exist, or what's out there in the universe? But within most theistic frameworks, God isn't a competing explanation alongside aliens for cosmic phenomena. God is understood as the foundational ground of existence itself, the reason there is something rather than nothing, while aliens, should they exist, would simply be another category of thing that exists within the universe God is understood to have created. No different in fundamental kind from stars, exoplanets, or terrestrial biology. This is structurally similar to why the discovery of any new natural phenomenon throughout history, germs, genes, black holes, exoplanets, never actually constituted evidence against God within mainstream theological frameworks, despite occasional popular claims to the contrary in specific historical controversies. New discoveries about the contents and mechanisms of the natural world were generally absorbed as discoveries about the creation, not challenges to the existence of a creator, because the theological claim was never actually located at the same level of explanation as the scientific one. The brevity of this response: nothing. The existence of alien life does not preclude the concept of God, is itself the point. For many religious frameworks, this isn't a difficult question requiring extended theological labor to resolve. It's a non-issue, addressed in a single sentence because the underlying logic was never actually complicated. Story 8, the harder question. What if aliens created us instead of God? This is, genuinely, the sharpest and most theologically destabilizing question on this entire list, and it's worth taking seriously precisely because it doesn't accept the easy aliens are just more of God's creation resolution that most of the other responses settle into comfortably. The scenario being proposed isn't simply intelligent life exists elsewhere. It's the directed panspermia hypothesis, taken to its most theologically pointed conclusion, that humanity's origin specifically traces not to divine creation, but to deliberate biological engineering or seeding by another, technologically advanced species. This is a genuinely different category of challenge from simple coexistence because it directly targets the causal mechanism that most theistic traditions place at the center of human origin, the claim that humans exist because God specifically, deliberately, brought them into being. If an advanced alien civilization were definitively shown to have engineered human origins through, say, incontrovertible genetic or archaeological evidence, religious traditions would face a genuinely harder reconciliation problem than are their other inhabited planets, because it directly displaces a causal claim central to most creation theology rather than simply adding new entities to an already vast creation. Some traditions might respond by relocating God one level up the causal chain. God created the aliens, who then created us, preserving ultimate divine causation while accepting an intermediate biological mechanism, which is actually a coherent theological move, with precedent in how many traditions already handle evolution, treating natural selection as the mechanism God employs rather than evidence against divine involvement. Other traditions, particularly those more committed to direct, unmediated divine creation accounts, would face a considerably more difficult reconciliation. This question deserves more attention than it usually gets in casual religion and aliens conversations, precisely because most such conversations default to the easier coexistence framing rather than engaging with origin displacement directly. Story 9, I just switched to the alien religion if it's cooler. The joke that reveals a real pattern. This response is delivered as a joke, and it should be read primarily as one, but it's worth noting that the joke works specifically because it pokes at a genuinely real historical pattern: religious conversion driven substantially by aesthetic, cultural, or practical appeal rather than purely doctrinal conviction has happened repeatedly throughout actual human history, which gives the joke a sharper edge than pure absurdism would. Religious conversion across history has frequently been entangled with considerations beyond abstract theological persuasion, political alliance, social advancement, cultural prestige, and yes, in some documented cases, genuine aesthetic or experiential appeal of ritual, art, music, or community associated with a particular tradition. The spread of various religious traditions along trade routes throughout history often correlated as strongly with the cultural and economic prestige of the civilizations practicing them as with any independent doctrinal evaluation by converts. The joke's premise, that contact with a sufficiently impressive, technologically and perhaps spiritually advanced alien civilization might produce a wave of conversion to whatever belief system they brought with them, driven by the sheer impressiveness of the messenger, rather than careful theological comparison, isn't actually historically unprecedented as a category of human behavior, even though the specific scenario is obviously speculative. Colonial-era missionary success was frequently aided, uncomfortably, by the technological and military dominance of the colonizing civilization, with some converts explicitly motivated by access to that civilization's evident power and resources, rather than by independent theological conviction. What makes the joke land as comedy, rather than serious commentary, is the casualness of "if it's cooler" as the stated criterion, flippantly reducing a profound spiritual decision to aesthetic preference. But underneath the flippancy is a genuinely uncomfortable historical truth about how malleable religious affiliation has actually proven to be when confronted with sufficiently impressive or powerful alternatives. Story 10, Proxima Centauri b, would just be the next stop on the same missionary map. This response draws a direct, deliberately uncomfortable parallel between historical colonial-era missionary expansion and how a future encounter with extraterrestrial intelligence might unfold. And the comparison deserves serious engagement rather than dismissal, because it's grounded in real, documented historical pattern rather than speculation alone. European contact with the Americas and Australia followed an extremely consistent pattern. Military and economic conquest proceeded alongside, and was frequently justified by missionary conversion efforts targeting indigenous populations, often with explicit theological framing that treated previously uncontacted peoples as souls in need of saving, regardless of whether those peoples had any interest in being saved or any say in the matter at all. This pattern repeated across multiple European colonial powers, multiple continents, and multiple centuries, with enough consistency that it represents a genuine structural tendency rather than an isolated historical incident. The pointed implication of this response is that the same institutional and psychological machinery that produced that pattern, the conviction that one's own belief system represents universal truth applicable to all rational beings, combined with the practical capability to reach and contact previously unreached populations, wouldn't simply evaporate if the next previously unreached population happened to live on a planet around a different star rather than a different continent. Proxima Centauri b, the nearest known potentially habitable exoplanet, becomes in this framing simply the next item on a missionary expansion list that has, throughout history, treated newly discovered populations as opportunities rather than as autonomous societies deserving of being approached on their own terms. This isn't necessarily a cynical claim that all religious motivation toward potential alien contact would be purely conquest-driven. Many traditions, as other responses on this list make clear, have developed genuinely more pluralistic, less conquest-oriented theological frameworks, but the historical pattern this response highlights is real, well-documented, and worth taking seriously as a genuine risk in any future first contact scenario, rather than dismissing as needlessly cynical speculation. Story 11, it wouldn't have any impact. The shortest, most common answer on this entire thread, this response, is barely a sentence, and that's exactly what makes it worth examining as data rather than dismissing as unhelpfully brief. Across this entire thread, variations of this "wouldn't change anything for me" appear with striking frequency from people across genuinely different religious traditions. Catholic, Hindu, Buddhist, Vedic, and several others represented elsewhere on this list, which suggests something more structurally interesting than individual apathy or lack of imagination. The popular cultural narrative around religion and potential alien contact, heavily shaped by decades of science fiction and a particular strand of secular commentary, tends to assume that confirmed extraterrestrial life would function as a kind of stress test for religious belief, exposing fragility or forcing dramatic theological renegotiation. The actual, repeated pattern of responses from religious people themselves, across this thread and in broader surveys on the topic, tells a noticeably different story. For a large proportion of religious believers, the question of alien life was either already theologically accounted for, or simply never structurally connected to the parts of their belief system that feel load-bearing and essential. This gap between secular expectation and religious self-report is itself a genuinely interesting sociological phenomenon. It suggests that a meaningful portion of public discourse about what would happen to religion if we found aliens has been constructed more from assumptions about how religious belief systems theoretically should be vulnerable to disruption, rather than from actually asking religious people what their frameworks can and cannot accommodate. The brevity of it wouldn't have any impact as a direct, repeated answer across multiple traditions on this very thread is itself a small but genuine piece of evidence against the more dramatic crisis narrative that continues to dominate popular speculation about this topic. Story 12 Buddhism already has other world systems with their own Buddhas. This is one of the more genuinely startling entries on this list for anyone unfamiliar with Buddhist cosmology specifically, because it's not a modern theological accommodation invented to deal with contemporary astronomical discoveries. It's a long-standing, textually documented feature of traditional Buddhist cosmological literature that predates any scientific awareness of exoplanets by well over 2,000 years. Traditional Buddhist cosmology, as described across various sutras and commentarial literature, describes a structure of innumerable world systems extending across a vast cosmos, often organized into clusters described in specific numerical terms: a world system, or Buddha field containing many worlds, with countless such systems existing across the totality of existence. Crucially, several of these texts explicitly describe other world systems as containing their own sentient beings, their own complete cycles of existence, and in some traditions, their own fully enlightened Buddhas teaching the Dharma to the beings of those specific worlds, entirely independent of and parallel to Shakyamuni Buddha's teaching here on Earth. This cosmological framework means that, for Buddhist traditions drawing on this textual heritage, the discovery of intelligent life on another planet wouldn't represent new theological territory requiring careful reconciliation. It would represent the confirmation of a category of existence the tradition had already described, in broad strokes, for millennia. The specific scientific mechanism, evolution on another planet, rather than the cosmological framework described in the sutras, would differ. But the basic claim that sentient beings exist across an unimaginably vast cosmos, not limited to Earth or to human beings specifically, was never something Buddhist cosmology needed modern astronomy to first propose. This is a genuinely distinct situation from traditions that have had to develop new theological reasoning to accommodate alien life as a possibility. Several Buddhist traditions arrived at multi-world cosmology as a starting assumption millennia ago, making this one of the cleanest examples on this entire list of a religious framework where the science, if confirmed, would simply be catching up to the cosmology rather than challenging it. Story 13 CS. Lewis's theory, the speed of light is God's quarantine law. This is a genuinely fascinating piece of theological speculation from one of the 20th century's most influential Christian writers, and it deserves to be understood in full because it's considerably more sophisticated than a passing remark. Lewis developed this idea across multiple essays and worked it directly into his science fiction trilogy, beginning with Out of the Silent Planet. The argument Lewis developed runs as follows. The vast distances between star systems, combined with the absolute physical limit imposed by the speed of light, mean that any civilization capable of reaching another star system would necessarily have to be extraordinarily technologically advanced and almost certainly extraordinarily patient, given the travel times involved even at theoretical maximum speeds. Lewis proposed that this physical limitation might not be an unfortunate cosmic accident, but could be understood, theologically, as a deliberately designed safeguard, a kind of built-in containment system preventing morally corrupted civilizations. And Lewis, writing as a Christian deeply concerned with humanity's capacity for sin and conquest, considered Earth itself, potentially, among the morally compromised, from easily reaching and despoiling other inhabited worlds, and vice versa, protecting other potentially innocent civilizations from whatever corruption might exist on Earth. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet trilogy dramatized this concept directly, portraying Earth specifically as a silent planet, cut off from a wider, healthier galactic spiritual community, partly because of humanity's own fallen nature, with the vast distances of space functioning as a protective barrier rather than merely an engineering inconvenience. This theory is genuinely elegant as theological speculation because it takes a real, well-understood physical constraint, the speed of light limit established by special relativity, and assigns it theological purpose without requiring any modification to the actual physics involved. It's not a claim that contradicts science. It's a claim about why the science might be the way it is, which is a different and considerably more defensible category of theological move. Story 14, whatever spiritual truths apply to humans would apply to aliens too. Adjusted for their nature, this response articulates something philosophically careful and worth unpacking slowly. Because it's not simply asserting aliens would be fine within my religion. It's making a more precise claim about how theological principles generalize across different kinds of beings, which is a genuinely sophisticated piece of religious reasoning. The core claim is that the spiritual implications a particular religious tradition identifies for humans, concepts like moral responsibility, capacity for relationship with the divine, the possibility of spiritual growth or its absence, aren't actually defined in a way that's exclusively and necessarily tied to human biology or human psychology specifically. Rather, these implications are tied to more abstract qualifying conditions, the capacity for reason, for free will, for moral agency, for some form of consciousness or inner experience. If those underlying conditions are met by a being, the argument goes, the same broad theological framework would apply to that being too, but expressed and experienced in ways compatible with the nuances of their own natures, which is the crucial qualifying clause doing real work in this response. This is theologically similar to long-standing internal debates within several traditions about how moral and spiritual categories apply across the diversity of human experience itself. Debates about moral responsibility and culpability for people with different cognitive capacities, different life circumstances, or different cultural contexts, where most sophisticated theological traditions have already developed frameworks emphasizing that the underlying principle, neural agency, capacity for relationship with God, remains constant while its specific expression, and the standards by which it's judged can reasonably vary according to the particular nature and circumstances of the being in question. Extending that same flexible principle, variable expression framework to an entirely different species, with potentially radically different cognitive architecture, sensory experience, and social structure, is a logical extension rather than an entirely new theological innovation. The hard theological work, in this view, was already done internally, addressing human diversity. Aliens would just be an unusually dramatic test case for principles the tradition had already built flexibility into. Story 15, Hinduism has never claimed only humans have souls, or that Earth is the only inhabited world. This response lays out a theological framework that is, in several specific respects, structurally better positioned to absorb confirmed alien life without strain than many other traditions. And it's worth understanding exactly why, point by point. First, the cosmological claim. Hindu cosmology has historically described a vast, cyclical, multi-layered universe containing multiple realms and world systems, often described across different texts in cosmic timescales spanning billions of years. Timescales that notably align far more comfortably with modern scientific understanding of the universe's actual age than the considerably shorter cosmic timelines found in some other religious traditions' creation accounts. A universe this vast, populated across many realms, was never theologically required to contain only one inhabited world. Second, and perhaps more significant for this specific question, is the soul claim. Many Hindu philosophical traditions hold that the Atman, variously translated as soul, self, or essential nature, is present in all living beings, not exclusively in humans. This stands in genuine contrast to theological frameworks elsewhere on this list. See the Catholic response discussing animals and souls that draw a firm boundary specifically around human beings as uniquely ensouled or made in the image of the divine. If soul possession in this framework isn't a uniquely human property to begin with, then a newly discovered category of conscious being, terrestrial animal or extraterrestrial alien alike, wouldn't require any new theological category. They'd simply be additional beings already covered by an existing, non-exclusive framework. Third, the salvation point. Because liberation in this framework is understood as something every soul eventually achieves when the time is right for each one, rather than something requiring active intervention, doctrine, or conversion from outside, there's no missionary urgency or theological anxiety about whether aliens have received the message the way some other traditions might. Experience. The framework simply doesn't generate that particular kind of pressure. Story 16. Buddhism was never human-centered, so extraterrestrials would just be more students of the Dharma. This response highlights a structural feature of Buddhist philosophy that distinguishes it meaningfully from several other major world religious traditions. When it comes to questions about non-human intelligence, Buddhism's core teachings were never originally framed around humanity's special, cosmic status or unique relationship with a creator deity in the way many theistic traditions are. The Dharma, the body of Buddhist teaching concerning the nature of suffering, its causes, and the path to liberation from it, is explicitly framed in terms of sentient beings generally, not humans specifically. The Four Noble Truths concerning suffering and its cessation are presented as universal observations about the nature of conscious experience and craving, applicable in principle to any being capable of experiencing suffering and craving, regardless of species or biological substrate. Traditional Buddhist cosmology, as discussed elsewhere on this list, already populates its vast cosmos with numerous categories of sentient beings beyond humans, including beings in various heavenly and lower realms, none of which required special theological pleading to fit into the existing framework. This means that, structurally, Buddhism doesn't face the same kind of "are non-humans eligible for what we offer" question that traditions built around human-specific covenant relationships, human-specific creation in the divine image, or human-specific redemption narratives can face when confronted with non-human intelligence. If a being can suffer, crave, and potentially achieve liberation from that craving through understanding and practice, the existing framework already applies to them in principle, without requiring any new doctrinal category to be invented specifically to accommodate them. The phrase "happily teach the Dharma to extraterrestrials" captures this well. It's not framed as a missionary obligation born of urgency or competition, in the way some other traditions might frame outreach to a newly discovered population, but as a natural, low-friction extension of teaching that was never restricted to humans as its intended audience in the first place. Story 17. Ancient Vedic texts already describe life on other planets and interplanetary travel. This is a genuinely striking claim worth examining carefully, because it's asserting something more specific than general cosmic vastness. It's claiming that specific, ancient textual sources already contain developed concepts of inhabited planets beyond Earth, and even travel between them, long predating any scientific framework that could have informed such ideas through observation. Vedic literature and the broader corpus of associated texts within Hindu tradition do describe a cosmology featuring multiple locus, often translated as planetary systems or realms, populated by various categories of beings, with some texts describing movement or travel between these realms by certain beings under certain conditions, often described in spiritual or yogic rather than purely mechanical terms. Traditional commentators and practitioners within this lineage have, for a long time, pointed to these textual descriptions as evidence that the tradition's cosmological framework was never narrowly Earth-centered or limited to to a single inhabited world. It's worth being precise about the nature of this claim rather than overstating it. These textual descriptions of multiple inhabited locus operate within a cosmological and metaphysical framework that is structurally different from modern astrophysics' description of literal exoplanets orbiting distant stars. And equating the two directly requires interpretive choices that are contested even within scholarly study of these traditions, let alone by outside academic historians of religion. The lokas described in these texts are generally understood within a framework that includes subtle or non-physical realms alongside what might be considered more literally physical ones, which is a different cosmological structure from simply more planets like Earth orbiting other stars. What is genuinely notable, regardless of how one interprets the cosmological specifics, is that a tradition with textual roots reaching back several thousand years developed a framework comfortable with multiple inhabited realms and beings beyond humans from a very early point, well before any external scientific pressure existed to require such accommodation. The claim nothing would change carries real weight when the framework was built this way from the outset, rather than retrofitted under modern pressure. Story 18. What if aliens have their own Gaia, their own Helios, and they're nothing like us? This response takes the conversation in a genuinely different and more imaginative direction than most of the others on this list, moving past the question of theological compatibility and into something closer to comparative religious anthropology applied to a hypothetical first contact scenario. And it's worth sitting with the specific questions being raised because they're genuinely interesting ones that get surprisingly little serious attention. The first question, whether a deity like Helios or Sol, historically conceived as the god specifically of our own sun, might be understood as the deity of all stars universally, or might be a more locally specific entity tied to this particular star, is a genuinely interesting theological question about the scope and jurisdiction of polytheistic deities specifically. Since polytheistic religious systems across history have generally conceived of their gods as having particular domains and particular relationships to particular places and phenomena, rather than the universal, all-encompassing scope more typical of monotheistic conceptions of the divine. Would a sun god necessarily scale up to encompass all suns everywhere, or would each star, in principle, have or need its own distinct deity if other inhabited systems exist? The second, more speculative and more interesting question is whether genuinely independent alien religious traditions, evolving on a completely separate world with no contact with Earth, might independently arrive at structurally similar deity categories, an Earth Mother figure analogous to Gaia, a Sky Father, a sun deity, purely because certain environmental and existential pressures, dependence on a home star, dependence on a planetary surface, mortality. Seasonal cycles might be sufficiently universal across any technological civilization's early development to produce convergent religious symbolism, independent of any shared cultural origin. This response's closing reference to Wittgenstein's observation that if a lion could speak, we could not understand him points towards something genuinely profound, that meaningful exchange with a truly alien intelligence might require confronting the limits of mutual comprehension itself, which would be a far richer and stranger encounter than simple theological comparison alone could capture. Story 19. An animist, pluralistic faith where even words have souls. Aliens would just be more spiritual beings. This response describes a religious framework that's structurally distinct from most others discussed on this list, and the specific combination of features described here: fate rather than fixed divine plan, explicit theological pluralism, an animism extending personhood to non-living things including words themselves, produces a uniquely well-adapted framework for absorbing alien contact without any meaningful theological disruption. The fate rather than fixed plan distinction matters more than it might initially appear. Frameworks built around a specific, predetermined divine plan for human history and human salvation specifically can face genuine tension when confronted with beings outside that plan's stated scope. Were the aliens included in the plan? And if not, Why not? And what does that mean for them? A framework built instead around fate as a flexible, responsive trajectory rather than a fixed, predetermined blueprint doesn't generate this particular tension because there's no specific textual or doctrinal commitment about exactly which beings the trajectory was always meant to include. The pluralism point addresses a different potential friction point directly. Many of the more uncomfortable historical episodes involving religion and newly contacted peoples discussed elsewhere on this list regarding colonial missionary expansion stemmed specifically from traditions holding that there is one correct belief system and salvation pathway, with deep theological stakes riding on whether newly encountered peoples adopted it. A genuinely pluralistic framework which holds no particular issue with other beings worshiping different gods or no gods at all removes that entire category of friction and urgency from the equation by design. And the animism point is perhaps the most philosophically generous element described here. A worldview already extending personhood and soul to entities far less obviously alive than an alien being, including words themselves, would have essentially no conceptual difficulty extending full spiritual recognition to genuinely conscious extraterrestrial life. The framework's baseline threshold for spiritual personhood is already set lower, and more inclusively, than the bar an alien encounter would need to clear. Story 20, the Quran and extraterrestrial life, a topic with more textual material than you'd expect Islamic theological engagement with the question of extraterrestrial life, draws on specific textual material within the Quran itself, which gives this conversation a more grounded textual basis than purely speculative theological reasoning alone. And it's worth understanding what the actual sources say rather than treating this as purely modern speculation grafted onto an ancient text. The Quran contains several verses that scholars engaging with this question point to directly, most notably references to Allah being Lord of the world's phrase appearing prominently and repeatedly, including in the Quran's opening chapter, recited by practicing Muslims multiple times daily in prayer, and the phrase describing creation across the seven heavens and the earth and whatever is between them, language that many commentators across Islamic scholarly history have read as implying a cosmos considerably larger and more populated than Earth alone, even though pre-modern commentators obviously lacked any scientific framework for understanding what such a claim might concretely entail in terms of other planets specifically. Verse 42:29 of the Quran is cited particularly frequently in modern discussions of this topic, as it explicitly references Allah having created the heavens and earth and what He has scattered between them of creatures. Language that contemporary Islamic scholars engaging with astrobiology and the search for extraterrestrial life have pointed to as textual grounding for taking the possibility of life beyond Earth seriously within an Islamic theological framework, rather than treating it as a foreign concept requiring awkward retrofitting. Contemporary Muslim scholars and astronomers, including figures associated with various national space programs in Muslim-majority countries, have engaged with this question directly and generally concluded that confirmed extraterrestrial life would be entirely compatible with and arguably anticipated by existing Quranic cosmology, rather than representing any kind of theological challenge requiring defensive reinterpretation. This is a case where the textual groundwork for accommodating the discovery substantially predates the scientific question itself by roughly 14 centuries. Story 21, if aliens have free will and their own beliefs, meeting them is just interfaith dialogue. This response proposes a genuinely useful reframing for thinking about first contact theologically, rather than treating an encounter with intelligent alien life as an unprecedented category of event requiring entirely new theological tools. It suggests treating it as structurally analogous to something humanity already has extensive practice with: interfaith dialogue and engagement between people of different, sometimes radically different, religious traditions here on Earth. The reasoning hinges on a specific qualifying assumption stated directly in the response, that the aliens in question are conscious beings possessing free will, and that it's reasonable to assume they would have developed their own religious or philosophical belief systems independently. Given that the development of some kind of meaning-making framework, moral system, or cosmological belief structure appears to be a remarkably consistent feature of human societies across every documented culture throughout history, suggesting it may be a more general feature of sufficiently complex, self-aware, social intelligence rather than something uniquely human. If that assumption holds, the proposed framework follows naturally, engaging respectfully with a different intelligent species belief system, assuming no hostile intent on their part, wouldn't be fundamentally different in kind from a person of one faith engaging respectfully and openly with a person of a substantially different faith tradition here on Earth, learning about their beliefs, sharing your own, finding points of genuine connection and points of genuine difference, without necessarily requiring either party to abandon their own framework or to view the encounter as a zero-sum theological competition. This is a notably less anxious and less missionary urgent framing than several other responses on this list, paired directly to the Vatican conversion stance or the colonial expansion parallel discussed elsewhere, and it suggests that how religious traditions and individuals might actually respond to alien contact may depend heavily on which existing human-to-human interfaith framework they reach for as their nearest available model, competitive conversion, or respectful pluralistic exchange, rather than on anything intrinsic to the situation of alien contact itself. Story 22. Technically, we already have confirmed evidence of alien life. It's just microbial. This response makes a useful, often overlooked clarification that's worth sitting with, because the popular cultural imagination around discovering alien life almost always defaults immediately to intelligent, communicating beings, when the actual scientific search for extraterrestrial life is overwhelmingly, currently, focused on a much more modest and much more likely first discovery: microbial or otherwise simple biological life. As of the current state of astrobiology research, no confirmed extraterrestrial life of any kind, microbial or otherwise, has actually been verified, despite the response's phrasing suggesting otherwise. What does exist are several genuinely promising, but not yet conclusively confirmed, candidate signals. Certain meteorites, including the well-studied ALH 84001 Martian meteorite, have shown structures that some researchers interpreted as potential microfossils, though this interpretation remains contested and not broadly accepted as confirmed evidence. Various missions to Mars have detected seasonal methane fluctuations in the Martian atmosphere that remain scientifically unexplained and could, speculatively, relate to biological activity, though geological explanations haven't been ruled out either. What this response gets functionally right, even if its specific framing of already discovered overstates current confirmed evidence, is the broader point about expectation management. If and when confirmed extraterrestrial life is actually announced, the overwhelming statistical likelihood, based on everything we understand about the conditions required for complex multicellular and eventually intelligent life to develop, versus the considerably less restrictive conditions required for simple microbial life, is that the discovery will be microbial, not intelligent, and quite possibly extinct rather than currently living, found perhaps in ancient Martian rock or in the subsurface oceans of icy moons like Europa or Enceladus. This matters directly for the religious dimension of this entire conversation, because a confirmed microbial discovery would almost certainly generate vastly less theological reckoning of any kind across virtually every tradition discussed on this list than the more dramatic intelligent contact scenario most of these responses are actually engaging with. Story 23. A Catholic's honest I don't know. Treating aliens like we treat animals, theologically speaking, this response stands out on this entire list for its genuine epistemic humility, and it's worth appreciating specifically because it resists the temptation, visible in several other responses, to confidently resolve a genuinely open theological question with a tidy answer. The Catholic theological position summarized here is reasonably precise, formal church teaching, holds that humans specifically are created in the image of God Dia and are understood within standard doctrine to possess an eternal, immortal soul in a way that animals are not formally taught to possess, at least within the most common interpretive tradition. This creates a real, specific category distinction within Catholic theology between humans and all other terrestrial life, one that isn't simply hand-waved away in casual conversation, but is actually doctrinally load-bearing in ways that matter for questions about salvation, moral status, and ultimate destiny. The genuinely interesting and honest move in this response is refusing to simply slot aliens into either side of that existing human/animal binary with false confidence. Rather than declaring aliens definitely ensouled and therefore eligible for the same salvation framework as humans, or definitively soulless and therefore outside any meaningful theological consideration the way animals are formally treated, the response holds the question open. I don't know what the afterlife looks like for them, or if there is one. This honest uncertainty is theologically more defensible than it might initially seem, precisely because the entire category of extraterrestrial rational being was never actually addressed by the doctrinal tradition that developed the human-animal distinction in the first place. That distinction was built entirely around terrestrial categories the Church had actual experience reasoning about. Extending it confidently in either direction to a genuinely novel category of being, without any direct doctrinal guidance on that specific question, would arguably be less intellectually honest than simply acknowledging the limits of what current teaching actually addresses. Story 24 angels are technically aliens, not from Earth, super intelligent, and capable of interdimensional travel. This is one of the more provocative and genuinely interesting reframings on this entire list, and it works specifically because it takes biblical descriptions of angels seriously on their own textual terms, and then applies modern science fiction vocabulary to those descriptions, producing a genuinely uncomfortable but logically defensible parallel. The biblical depiction of angels, examined closely across various texts, does include several characteristics that map remarkably well onto popular conceptions of advanced extraterrestrial beings. Angels are consistently described as non-human, non-terrestrial beings whose origin is explicitly outside the physical, earthly realm. They're depicted as possessing intelligence, knowledge, and capability substantially exceeding human capacity. Various biblical accounts describe angelic beings appearing and disappearing in ways that suggest movement between distinct planes of existence or reality, sometimes described in language that maps loosely onto what a modern reader might call interdimensional travel. The Book of Ezekiel's famously strange and vivid descriptions of celestial beings and wheeled, multi-eyed structures have, in fact, been cited for decades by ancient astronaut theorists as potential descriptions of literal extraterrestrial spacecraft, though this specific interpretation is rejected by essentially all mainstream biblical scholarship as a serious misreading of clearly symbolic and visionary religious literature. The fallen angels' extension in this response adds an additional layer worth noting. If angels generally fit a structural description resembling powerful, non-terrestrial, more intelligent than human beings, then fallen angels, angels in rebellion against the divine order, according to traditional theology, would represent the hostile or antagonistic version of that same category, which maps onto a genuinely common science fiction trope of malevolent, advanced alien visitors. This reframing doesn't require any actual modification of traditional theology. It's simply applying a different vocabulary to existing doctrinal descriptions, and the fact that doing so produces such a clean structural parallel says something genuinely interesting about how the categories angel and alien may be doing remarkably similar conceptual work within their respective frameworks. Story 25, the Bible doesn't tell us about aliens. For the same reason it doesn't explain calculus, this response offers a genuinely clean and well-reasoned answer to a question that trips up a lot of people on both sides of the religion and aliens conversation. Why doesn't a text claiming to be divinely inspired and comprehensive simply address the question of extraterrestrial life directly, one way or the other, if it's such a significant question? The answer proposed here reframes what the Bible is actually understood, within this tradition, to be for. Rather than functioning as a comprehensive encyclopedia of all factual information about the universe, including information that would be entirely irrelevant to its actual stated purpose, the text is understood as a practical and moral guide specifically oriented toward human relationship with God and ethical conduct in human life. Within that framing, the absence of any direct statement about extraterrestrial life isn't a gap or oversight requiring explanation. It's entirely consistent with the text's actual scope and purpose, exactly the way the text's silence on, say. The mathematics of orbital mechanics or the biochemistry of photosynthesis isn't treated as a meaningful theological gap either, because those topics were simply never within its intended domain. This response is more cool stuff God-made framing for how a confirmed alien discovery would actually land emotionally is worth noting too, because it captures a genuinely common pattern across many of the more confident responses on this list, treating novel cosmic discoveries not as theologically threatening information requiring careful management, but as additional, welcome detail about the scope of an already accepted creation, filling in blanks rather than challenging foundations. This kind of reasoning, that a religious text's silence on a topic reflects its intended scope rather than a deficiency requiring theological scrambling, has been applied by various theological traditions to numerous other scientific domains over the centuries, generally with more long-term success and stability than approaches that have attempted to read modern scientific claims directly into ancient texts that weren't actually making those specific claims to begin with. Story 26. Wait. If you believe in God, you already believe in one extraterrestrial being. This is a genuinely clever piece of logical reframing, and it's worth slowing down on, because the argument, while presented almost as a gotcha, actually does real conceptual work that's relevant to the entire broader conversation this list is built around. The core claim hinges on a specific, careful definition of extraterrestrial, literally, not of or from Earth. Most major theistic traditions describe God as the creator of Earth and the universe, existing prior to and independent of physical creation itself, and explicitly not originating from Earth in any meaningful sense. God's existence and nature are generally described as transcending the physical universe entirely, rather than originating from any specific point within it, including this planet. By this strict definitional standard, the response argues, anyone holding a standard theistic belief in a creator God already accepts the existence of at least one being whose origin is, definitionally, not terrestrial. The qualifying clause the response includes, unless you believe God originated from Earth, is doing important logical work, correctly anticipating that virtually no major theistic tradition actually makes that specific claim, since most theological frameworks place God's existence and nature as prior to and independent of the physical creation of Earth specifically, and the universe more broadly. What this observation accomplishes, even though it's presented somewhat playfully, is a genuine destabilization of the assumed sharp boundary between theological concepts and extraterrestrial life that the underlying question of this entire thread takes for granted. If a being existing independently of and prior to Earth is already a comfortable, foundational part of someone's worldview, the psychological and conceptual leap required to additionally accept other, considerably more modest, non-terrestrial beings, biological aliens existing within the same physical universe God is understood to have created, may be considerably smaller than popular assumptions about religious resistance to the idea of aliens generally suggest. Story 27. The Watchers and the Elohim, non-human beings already named in Scripture. This response points toward a genuinely interesting and somewhat under-discussed body of biblical and extra-biblical textual material that scholars of ancient religious cosmology take seriously as evidence of a more populated, more cosmically complex ancient Israelite and early Jewish worldview than the simplified, popular conception of biblical cosmology often assumes. Elohim is the Hebrew term most commonly translated simply as God in most English Bible translations, but the term is grammatically plural, and its actual usage across the Hebrew Bible is considerably more complex and contested among scholars than the standard translation suggests. Some passages appear to use the term in contexts that scholars of comparative ancient Near Eastern religion have argued may reflect an earlier conceptual framework involving a divine council or assembly of multiple heavenly beings, rather than always referring exclusively to a single supreme deity, a scholarly position with real textual support, though it remains debated rather than universally accepted within biblical scholarship. The Watchers specifically refers to a category of heavenly beings described prominently in the Book of Enoch, a text considered scripturally canonical within the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition specifically, though not part of the standard biblical canon for most other Christian and Jewish traditions, making its theological authority genuinely contested rather than universal. The Watchers in this text are described as a category of angelic beings who descended to earth, took human wives, and produced offspring in narrative material that significantly elaborates on the much briefer and more cryptic account of the sons of God and daughters of men found in Genesis chapter 6, immediately preceding the Genesis flood narrative. What this response highlights, regardless of how individual traditions weigh the canonical authority of these specific texts, is that the historical religious imagination underlying much of the biblical textual tradition was considerably more populated with categories of non-human, sometimes ambiguously embodied beings than the relatively streamlined, simplified version of biblical cosmology often presented in modern, mainstream religious education. Story 28, it depends entirely on what kind of alien life we're talking about. This response cuts through a meaningful amount of the abstraction present elsewhere on this list by pointing out something genuinely important and frequently overlooked in casual conversations about religion and alien contact: the theological, emotional, and practical implications of alien life is discovered depend enormously on what specifically gets discovered, and treating it as one single hypothetical scenario obscures dramatically different actual outcomes. Confirmed microbial life on Mars, or in the subsurface ocean of an icy moon like Europa, by far the most scientifically likely near-term discovery, as discussed elsewhere on this list, would, for the overwhelming majority of religious traditions and individuals, generate genuine scientific excitement without anything resembling theological crisis, precisely because microbial life doesn't raise questions about consciousness, moral status, communication, or salvation in the way intelligent contact would. Confirmed intelligent, communicating life roughly comparable to humans in cognitive and moral status, the scenario most of the rest of this list is actually engaging with, would raise the genuine theological questions about personhood, salvation eligibility, and interfaith-style engagement discussed extensively elsewhere in these responses. But the responses' final two categories deserve more attention than they usually get in this conversation. What about intelligent life so radically different from human cognition and biology that meaningful communication, mutual comprehension, or even confident assessment of whether the being qualifies as a person in any morally or theologically relevant sense becomes genuinely difficult or impossible? And what about an encounter with something whose nature is actively incomprehensible or existentially disturbing to the human mind, in ways that go beyond simple unfamiliarity into something closer to genuine horror or category collapse? These more extreme scenarios receive far less serious theological engagement across this list and the broader public conversation generally, precisely because they're harder to reason about confidently using existing frameworks. The honest answer to how would your faith respond may depend less on the faith itself and more on which of these wildly different scenarios actually occurs. Story 29, they'll say it's demons. The cynical prediction with real historical precedent. This is the shortest, sharpest, and most cynical response on this entire list, and it deserves serious consideration specifically because it's grounded in a genuinely documented historical pattern rather than being purely speculative pessimism about religious reactions. The prediction here is that, rather than the various thoughtful theological accommodations discussed throughout most of this list, a meaningful segment of religious response to confirmed alien contact would instead reach immediately for a demonic or otherwise malevolent spiritual explanation, framing extraterrestrial beings not as fellow creations worthy of theological consideration, but as deceptive or hostile spiritual entities, possibly explicitly identified with existing categories of evil or demonic beings already present within the relevant tradition's theology. This prediction has genuine historical grounding worth taking seriously. Throughout history, encounters with the unfamiliar, new peoples, new natural phenomena, new technologies have repeatedly been interpreted by some religious communities through a lens of demonic or malevolent spiritual activity rather than neutral curiosity or theological accommodation, particularly within certain strands of more fundamentalist or apocalyptically oriented religious thought. There's also a specific, already existing tradition within some contemporary Christian apologetics and conspiracy-adjacent religious commentary that explicitly frames UFO phenomena and the broader modern UFO disclosure conversation as a deliberate demonic deception intended to prepare humanity for a false, ultimately demonic savior narrative timed to coincide with or precede genuinely apocalyptic biblical end times events. This isn't a fringe prediction invented for this response. It's an actual documented position with real identifiable proponents already actively publishing and preaching this specific framework well before any confirmed alien discovery has occurred. What makes this response a useful corrective to the rest of this list is the reminder that religious people is not a single, theologically coherent category that will respond uniformly. The thoughtful, pluralistic, and cosmologically flexible responses documented elsewhere on this list genuinely exist and are genuinely common. So does this. Both are real possible futures, and which one dominates the public conversation may depend heavily on which religious voices get the most attention in the moment such a discovery is actually announced. Story 30: There's nothing you can do. A superior species got to us first. The response that isn't really about religion at all, this final response, is genuinely interesting precisely because it doesn't actually engage with theology, scripture, or any specific religious framework at all, despite appearing on a thread explicitly about religious responses to alien contact. And that absence is itself worth examining as the closing note for this entire collection. The framing here treats the scenario in purely geopolitical and power dynamic terms, a more advanced civilization reaching Earth first, rather than humanity reaching them, places humanity in a position of relative vulnerability and disadvantage by default, and the only meaningful responses available. In this framing are pragmatic accommodation or pragmatic resistance, making peace with a superior power, or defending existing territory and resources against a potential threat. There's no theological category being invoked here at all, no question of souls, salvation, or divine plan. It's a realist, almost Hobbesian framework applied directly to a first contact scenario, stripped of any spiritual dimension whatsoever. This is worth including as the closing entry specifically, because it highlights, by sheer contrast with everything else on this list, just how much theological sophistication, comfort, and flexibility the other 29 responses actually represent. Confronting the prospect of alien contact through a purely power and survival lens, with no spiritual framework offering any additional meaning, comfort, or context for processing the event, is its own genuinely coherent way of thinking about the scenario, just one that happens to occupy a fundamentally different conceptual register from religious reasoning entirely. It's a useful reminder that not everyone, even within a thread specifically asking religious people to respond, will actually reach for their religious framework first when confronted with a sufficiently dramatic hypothetical. Some people, when imagining first contact, reach immediately for survival calculus instead, which says something genuinely interesting about which parts of human cognition religious or otherwise, actually activate first under the pressure of imagining genuinely unprecedented, high-stakes encounters with the unknown.